Now, to kick off this section in stream one, I'd like to introduce Diony Walsh. She has been involved in the conference so far, so you may have already had something to do with her with one of her earlier sessions. She's the president of the Australian Rangelands Society and a Northern Territory-based consultant whose expertise is grazing management, feed budgeting, and much more. A warm welcome to Diony Walsh.
Welcome to our presentation, How Deep Are the Pockets of the North Australian Environmental Capital Bank? We're here today to mount a case that rangeland grazing businesses must concurrently meet financial and environmental sustainability criteria so that the Natural Capital Bank is not bankrupted. Our presentation will cover 5 topics. We'll start with introducing the 5 elements of sustainability in Australian agriculture. We'll then pose a question. Are current sustainability definitions failing the rangelands? We'll introduce the concept of financial and environmental capital as banks. We'll then present our measurable definitions for financial and environmental sustainability. And we'll conclude our presentation with a recommended pathway forward for those grazing businesses in the rangelands who may be looking to change the way they do things. I'd now like to invite my co-presenter Phil Holmes to introduce us to the 5 elements of sustainability.
The literature identifies 5 elements that must be fulfilled to claim a sustainability imprimatur for Australian agriculture. In Australia, the financial and environmental elements typically take precedence when demonstrating sustainable agricultural production at the individual business level, and we'll focus on these 2 in this presentation. Importantly, the financial and environmental elements must be concurrent, with one not borrowing excessively from the other. But first to sustainability. This is just one example of a current industry definition of sustainability. Many such definitions are principle-based, and whilst they're worthy of visions to aspire to, the problem with principle-based definitions like this is that they tend to end up being vague and consequently not measurable. They also tend to cater for the lowest common denominator and often result in the illusion of doing something rather than actually achieving meaningful change. The absence of specific targets leads to a lack of accountability and measurable outcomes. Measurable performance in any arena requires specialist expertise in order to succeed, and sustainability is no exception. Dionne, can you explain why we find it easier to consider financial and environmental capital as banks?
We contend that financial and environmental capital can be considered as banks. This is probably easy for most people to visualise for financial capital because banking and finances go together, but it may be less obvious for environmental capital. But if we think of all banks as having finite resources that can be borrowed and repaid through responsible management, the concept of the environment and the grass resource being a bank in the rangelands becomes clearer. Currently in North Australia, land values are at unprecedented levels. Prices are being driven upwards by low interest rates, real estate speculation, international economic forces, and just the fear of missing out. The pressure on investors and owners to produce an acceptable return on their very large financial outlays leaves the environmental capital bank exposed to degradation in order to prop up financial performance. So just how strong is the environmental capital bank? I'm going to discuss this at 2 scales, both the landscape scale and the individual property scale. At the landscape scale, environmental data are often outdated or not even publicly available across the rangelands. The data are not collected using comparable metrics, nor are they reported consistently across the different jurisdictions. In most jurisdictions, the responsible authorities do not even know how many livestock are being run on their leasehold tenure. And all of these things combined makes it very hard to pinpoint what is going on with land condition at the landscape scale. But when we work with clients at the individual property scale, we see very clear evidence that livestock productivity and financial performance are correlated with annualised stocking rates and land condition. Most of our clients do not subscribe to the more cattle equals more money mantra, but rather than slowly going broke, as is the common assumption around running safe stocking rates, these businesses have eye-wateringly good animal productivity and business performance, and their rangelands are in great shape. So Phil, can you tell us a bit more about what's happening with the Financial Capital Bank?
15 years of data between 2005 and 2019 show that the average productivity of the northern beef herd at large is in slow decline to the tune of about 0.7 of a kilogram of beef produced per adult equivalent per annum. But what does that mean? Kilograms of beef per AE, what's that got to do with financial sustainability? You may well ask that. Herd productivity is a robust measure of business performance because it's revenue related. This metric, kilograms of beef produced per AE, has been shown to explain about 80% of the difference in herd revenue between herds. Data from the Australian Beef Report and private clients show that the differences in revenue explain more of the differences between businesses than any other measure. At first glance, this slide may indicate that the financial performance of the North Australian beef industry is in an unsustainable trajectory. But this graph doesn't tell the whole story. We are privileged to work with a cohort of beef producers in the north who are financially literate and are also heavily focused on environmental sustainability. Here are some recent Holmes and Company client data compared to the averages for the northern beef industry. Kilograms of beef produced per adult equivalent averaged 84 kilograms across the industry, but was 115 in the client cohort. The earnings before interest and tax was per AE around about $32.50 across the industry, but was close to $179 for the client cohort. Livestock productivity and financial performance could be so much better, and these data show that it's achievable. The fundamental question is, what's caused this disparity? We believe that too many beef producers in the north are distracted by peripheral issues and a lack of focus on the business profit drivers, especially if they're financially illiterate. Secondly, there's been a relatively low adoption rate of extension messages, despite the sound science behind most of them. Matching stocking rates to long-term carrying capacity is a good example. We need to concurrently measure financial and environmental performance at the individual business level. But to do this, we first need unambiguous definitions. Effective definitions are the starting point of all of this. If we don't get the definitions right, the rest falls over. To achieve financial sustainability, you need to be able to answer yes to two questions. And the first of these is, can you fund day-to-day operations without recourse to non-current debt? That means long-term debt. So it's okay to use an overdraft if you have one, but it must come back into the black at least once per annum. If the business can't do this, pardon me, the bank is funding operations, not the business. The second question is, are you provisioning for all current and future liabilities, including further land purchases without permanent erosion of equity? So, what are current and future liabilities? So it'll be capital expenditure in any given year, provisioning for retirement and business succession if that's appropriate, provisioning for failed seasons, and also the interest and principal repayments on capital acquisitions, which are mostly additional land. This definition raises an important issue, namely financial literacy. And there's a language used in this definition that requires financial literacy to understand, and we make no apologies for that. We argue that financial literacy is the starting point for managing a financially sustainable business and must be acquired. Diony, can you take us through your definitions for environmental sustainability?
Environmental sustainability will mean different things to different people depending on what they value. Some people will want to see biodiversity in a definition of environmental sustainability, whilst others will want to see greenhouse gas emissions or water use efficiency. There's a whole raft of metrics that fall under the environmental sustainability banner. We invite others to bring measurable definitions to the table for any environmental metrics that they wish. But for us, we've thought hard about this issue in the context of a grazing enterprise, and we've distilled 3 core questions that must be answered in the affirmative in all grazing enterprises if they are serious about sustainability. The first of these is, do you have an evidence-based estimate of your long-term carrying capacity? Long-term carrying capacity is the biological limit or foundation of every grazing business, and yet there are many producers in the Australian rangelands who don't know what this figure is for their particular enterprise. Related to this is, can you demonstrate that your 10-year average stocking rate has been consistent with this environmental limit? Of course, seasonal conditions change from year to year, and most producers also vary stocking rates in order to manage that variation. But over a longer period of time, the average of those annual stocking rates really should approximate this long-term carrying capacity limit. Finally, we ask a tough question. Is the majority of your land area in B land condition or better at least 7 years in 10? We anticipate that both our financial and environmental definitions may be judged to be contentious or too difficult to achieve. However, there's a small but growing cohort of North Australian beef producers who treat these definitions seriously to demonstrate voluntary compliance and to enhance their long-term business performance. And even if they can't meet all of these criteria right now, they're committed to achieving them and they're working hard towards them. So how do they do it? The approach that we recommend is essentially the same for the financial and environmental elements. So where you're doing an annual financial budget, you should also be doing an annual forage budget. Similarly, where you're doing an annual assessment of the financial condition of a business, you should also be doing an annual assessment of land condition. And if both are done concurrently, it significantly reduces the risk of bankruptcy in either element. It's time to wrap up with our recommendations for a pathway forward for those grazing businesses who may be looking to change the way that they're doing things. Over to you, Phil.
Financial literacy is the starting point, and you'll go nowhere without that. If you don't know what the business profit drivers are, you don't have a business, frankly. All you've got's a job. It's so easy to be distracted in agriculture as evidence-free fads pass the front gate every day. Be very careful that you do not become a victim and waste years of your tenure chasing a rainbow. Learn to manage land using evidence-based knowledge and skills. These include understanding the true long-term carrying capacity and productive potential of the feed resource, doing regular forage budgeting and undertaking repeatable land condition monitoring. Finally, we recommend that management decisions should be based on not only their financial merits, but also their environmental consequences.